My name is Lee Bates. I'm Chief of Criminal Justice Research and Evaluation at the Division of Criminal Justice Services. A couple of logistics before we begin. Please make sure your cell phones are silenced or on vibrate. You guys will get tired of hearing this, but the bathrooms are to your left when you come out the door. If you have questions, you can feel free to ask those at any time. If you have questions that we don't get a chance to answer during the presentation, you can come up after and find the presenters afterwards or find them in the hallways. So this is Diversion, a Municipal Continuum and Culture. In Albany, New York, a team of agencies is working on pre-arrest diversion, post-arrest diversion, and post-conviction diversion, creating a culture to halt mass incarceration and criminalization. As each agency embarked on their own initiatives to lessen recidivism, a culture of diversion developed. This roundtable will summarize the efforts of these agencies. During the discussion, attendees will learn the historical context in which diversion took place, including the barriers faced by each of the participants and how they eventually overcame these barriers and worked together to change the landscape of public safety in Albany County. It will further discuss initiatives ranging from nationally based programs such as law enforcement assisted diversion to unique jail-based treatment initiatives brought about with community partners and to groundbreaking felony-based diversion through uniquely developed restorative practices. Our panel today includes Brendan Cox, Director of Policing Strategies at the Lead National Support Bureau and retired Chief of Police in the Albany Police Department. Also, Albany County District Attorney David Soares and Assistant District Attorney Renee emerges. And also Kerry Thompson, Chief Deputy with the Albany County Sheriff's Office. And please see your programs for full bios for our panelists.
So good morning. How's everybody doing? So it was good. So some front chairs got filled in. So you always know you're in like a law enforcement room when like the back chairs always fill up first. So I was going to do this sitting down, but I realized nobody could see me, which I was trying to figure out maybe that would be a good thing if I spoke and nobody could see me. So you're probably figuring out, like, why are we talking about, like, diversion when we're at a gun violence symposium? And like, one of those reasons why we wanted to do that is we wanted to, like, first of all, recognize the work that the state has done with all of our agencies in bringing us to a point where we really strategize on what we do about crime. And if we think back to impact, for those of us that are old enough to remember that, we really started to have the state focus us on what happens with Part 1 crimes and how we strategize to bring those crime patterns down, to look at the crime patterns, map those out, strategically figure out how we reduce those crimes, share what we're doing with each other, and ultimately continue to drive crime down in New York State. And then once we got that and had our analysis going throughout the state said, hey, we're recognizing that we haven't done a lot in gun violence, and we still have these issues, especially in urban areas where we have a lot of gun violence, and we need to start taking a view on that. And we transitioned to looking at gun violence, and we really came up with strategies there. In Albany County, we really bought onto that, and we were kind of like to the state, hey, whatever you want us to try, we're open. And we really appreciated the fact that the state, time and time again, came to us and said, hey, we have this new program we'd like you guys to try out. And we're like, yeah, we'll do whatever you want because we want to stop gun violence. But one of the things that always came up for all of us was the fact that our community, although they obviously wanted to make sure there was no gun violence, they also spoke to a lot of us about low-level crimes, about disorder, but also about the fact that they didn't like much of the traditional policing that happened because of some of the trauma that we carry over. And we recognized that a lot of the lower level crimes that were being committed by prolific offenders, we weren't having a positive effect on stopping them from committing those crimes. So we would arrest the same people over and over again, and we wouldn't have the desired effect, especially when it came to drugs, crimes driven by substance use disorder, driven by mental health, driven by poverty. We weren't having those kinds of effects. So we were like, we need to do something. So one of the things that happened, and traditionally I think everybody can probably speak to this, if we go back a long way, we all worked in silos. David was really the first person in the county to come out and say we need to do things differently. And he didn't necessarily have the support when that happened. In fact, I won't say necessarily. He didn't have the support at that time. There was a lot of back and forth between other agencies, including the police department, Albany Police Department, you know, kind of like being very standoffish about him saying we need to change things. Well, thankfully, over time, we've changed. And what's come up is the fact that we have platforms individually. I shouldn't say we anymore. I'm not part of the Albany Police Department anymore. But we have these platforms both from the beginning, from the front end, to the middle, to the back end, to really start to look at the root cause of issues, to recognize that if we treat individuals differently, if we recognize that punishment's not going to necessarily be the thing that's going to change folks, because we've tried that for a long time. Like if we look at just drug crimes, if we look at how we've treated the prosecution of drug crimes, and we recognize that we had a 700% increase in folks going into jail and prison for drug crimes since 1980 to 1997, and that number is now flat. So it went from like 40,000 to 400,000, and that number's flat now from 97 to now. So just basic numbers. Yet drug use has continued to go up. So like that didn't deter people from using drugs. So if we know that, like there has to be other ways that we can try to affect that. So we've now looked at things from that front end to the middle end to the back end of how do we deal with folks, so that way when we ultimately not only fix them, but we make the community safer. So how do we do that from the different levels? How do we do that differently than arrest? Because there's got to be a recognition that arrest plus prosecution plus incarceration doesn't always equal public safety. There are obviously times when that does. And here at the GIVE conference, we know that if there's gun violence, yeah, arrest, prosecution, and incarceration equals public safety. Somebody fires a gun off in the street, they need to get taken off the street. But if somebody's got a behavioral health issue and they're committing a crime, or if somebody's living in poverty and they got to figure out how they're going to feed their kids and they steal from a grocery store, well, we need to figure out how we fix that. Because if we don't get to the root cause of the issue, then we're not going to get there. So when we're looking at how, especially from an administrative level, when you're responsible for not only driving crime down, but also improving the conditions of the city and improving conditions between relationships between you and your department and the community, you got to figure out how to do things differently. And then also why we're here today, because we look at the context of GIVE, when we ask our officers in our community to do more around gun violence, well, we got to find the time to be able to do that, right? We all have definitive resources. Like resources aren't like always at our beck and call, right? Especially in today's world. Recruitment and retention is like a hard thing in today's policing, right? Anybody dealing with that? I know it's early, but folks can shake their heads, right? So I know. Yeah. So people are having a hard time with getting cops, putting bodies out. Same thing for district attorney's office, probation, parole. It's difficult to carry all that. So if we're going to try to focus on gun violence, well, then we're going to need to free people up. But if our police officers, if our district attorneys, if our sheriff's deputies, if they're focusing on low-level crime, if they're tied up for 2.5 hours booking somebody, bless you, booking somebody for petty larceny, and that petty larceny was driven by the fact they have an addiction, well, they're not going to be able to be out on the street focusing on our violence issue. So we need to figure out how to do that. So we need to be able to figure that out. And then ultimately, when we talk about where we are in 21st century policing, even though it seems like 21st century policing doesn't exist anymore, or at least not the folks who came up with that term, if we want our police to be able to have that, and this is one of the things I looked at, if we want those positive relationships to be built between our police officers and the community, we need them to be able to have the time to do that. So again, if we want to be able to have the time to do that, we have to figure out how we make that time. So one of the things we know, if they're off the street and they're dealing with a low-level offender and they're tied up, then they're not going to be able to do those things. And if we're not ultimately fixing the problem and we're just creating more issues, then we need to change that. So that's kind of how we started to focus, at least from the police end, of like, why do we need to do things differently? Why do we need to try to figure out, God bless you, why do we need to try to figure things out to be different on the front end? Because ultimately, if we do the same things over and over again and we expect different results, we're not going to get those, right? And that's ultimately the definition of insanity. So we need to figure out how to do things differently. We need to give our officers different tools. Does anybody else in the room think like we've asked our police officers to do way too much? We've asked them to be social workers. And like, I know a lot of officers don't want to hear this, but at this point they are social workers because they're doing social workers' jobs out on the street. We've asked them to be substance use counselors. We've asked them to be mental health physicians and everything else in between. So how do we make it to where we can get them the resources to deal with issues and have them be able to step away? So one of those things we can do from the policing end, so David and Renee are going to talk about from the district attorney's end, Kerry's going to talk about from the sheriff's end, especially on the correctional end, what we can do when folks are in our custody. But I'll talk a little bit about what we can do from the police end, and that's about how we can do things where we ultimately have a lighter touch from the police end, get people help, step back, continue more accountability than we would have in the criminal justice system, and ultimately make things better. So I'll talk about that. So one of the things today, we're going to try to leave a lot of time on the back end for questions. I'm not opposed to if somebody's got a burning question, throw your hand up and we'll take that question. So I'd rather have this be interactive. I know it's hard, but if you got a burning question, just throw it out there. So lead. So I came from the Albany Police Department from 23 years. My bio's in your thing. Don't believe half of it is what it is. But what happened in Albany and why we looked at lead was because we had a very bad relationship with our community, especially our community of color. We had an historical issue going way back, and then at the end of the day, we just exacerbated that by making our police officers an occupying force in given neighborhoods to reduce crime. And that wasn't our police officers' fault, that was our fault from the administration. We said, you guys are going to be the ones that are going to stop all these crimes from happening. That's your job. Keep people safe. And we didn't give them a lot of tools to do that. They did a really good job at it. Crime went way down. When we talked to our community, we said, here's all your numbers. Look, you're safe. And the community said, well, you can show us those numbers all you want, but we don't feel safe. And we don't necessarily feel like you guys are a partner, and we don't necessarily think we really like you because we don't know you. We don't know the officers anymore. So we said, all right, we're going to go back to community policing. So we brought the community in, we brought our officers in, and we rebuilt our department around community policing. And between rebuilding around community policing and keeping a focus on what our crime was and how we continue to build strategies, we heard over and over again from both the community and our police that dealing with minor crimes, dealing with lower level crimes with prolific offenders, we were having no luck on ultimately addressing the core issues that underlie around those crimes being committed. So we tried a couple things on our own. We brought in a group of stakeholders, a group of service providers around people that were involved in sex work, and we said, hey, we've done some analysis around the people that are involved in sex work in the city, and we know there's domestic violence involved, we know there's mental health, we know there's substance use, we'd like you guys to help us out. And they were like, hey, we're going to do that. We said, all right, great, we will see you guys, we're going to have you meet everybody at Friday at 10 o'clock. And they're like, all right, 10 in the morning, we'll see you guys. We're like, nope, we need you guys at 10 at night. And they're like, no, we're closed. We don't work at 10 o'clock at night. And we're like, well, we need you at 10 o'clock at night. And they're like, nope, we're closed. So that never got off the ground because our partners wouldn't do that. They wouldn't come in at 10 o'clock at night. We then, with the state's help, did a program for juveniles. We tried to do basically a mobile center where we could do an assessment to determine what we were going to do with the kids. And it had some success, but it was a little clunky. We had some great partners, and some of them are in the room here, but it didn't work. But we did a couple of different pilots. Those ultimately didn't work, and we ultimately got invited by actually a civil rights leader in the city to see a presentation on LEAD. We didn't know what LEAD was at the time. LEAD had started in Seattle, and I don't know about anybody else, but at least at that time, Seattle's not that far away from me anymore because I go there a lot. But at that time, I'm like, Seattle? Like those bunch of crazy people? Really? We're going to listen about something at Seattle? Well, we went and we saw this program. What we learned was that we're going to give police officers a tool where when somebody commits a crime, and if it's a crime that we all agree we're willing to divert, An officer can make a call to a case manager. A case manager can come out. The officer can say, hey, here's Brendan Cox. I've known him for 10 years. I've arrested him 15 times. He's been smoking crack for the last 10 years. He's had a lot of issues in his life. He's had a lot going on. I've never had a difference when I arrested him. He's never gotten any help. When I came on in 1994, I thought arresting him was going to get him help. Nothing's worked. He gets arrested. He goes to court. Judge sees him, says, I'll see you back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks goes by. He doesn't show up. A bench warrant gets issued. I pick him up. He's got crack on him. I charge him. He goes before the judge. Judge says, I'll see you in 2 weeks. He doesn't show up for court. A warrant. Sound familiar? So everybody's frustrated. Nothing works. But in Seattle, what they did is instead of having that happen, and Seattle started because of racial disparities in the system, which, by the way, we obviously have in the city of Albany, and I'm sure if everybody looks at their numbers, they all have. I've yet to see anywhere that doesn't have racial disparities. But ultimately, what they were able to show us is that instead of having that frustration, a police officer can say, you know what, I'm not going to arrest you. I can call a case manager, and the case manager is going to come out and say, I'm going to work with you to get you help. And instead of worrying about that charge, all you need to do is an assessment, and when we do that assessment, that charge doesn't get filed. And it's just that one charge. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card forever. It's that one charge. And what that assessment's going to do is it's going to give us a game plan of how to move forward. And it's going to be based on a harm reduction philosophy. And harm reduction in law enforcement's kind of, it's a whole different world. But it's recognizing that not everybody is ready, willing, and able to change, and that we're going to meet you where you're at, both figuratively and literally. So if you're living under a bridge, that's where we're going to go meet you. We recognize that you're not going to make it into an office to meet me if I'm the case manager, and that if you're still using drugs and you're like, I'm not going to stop using drugs, we're not going to kick you out of the program because you're doing something that we're opposed to. We're going to work with you, and we're going to try to bring you along in incremental steps, and we're going to work on that issue, but we're going to recognize there's a lot of underlying issues we got to get to first. There's a lot of the folks we deal with have underlying trauma, and until we deal with that trauma, we're never going to get to the drug use. And in fact, sometimes we deal with the trauma, and the drug use goes away. Because folks, that trauma is why they're using drugs. Or the mental health issue is why they're using drugs, because they're self-medicating. So the traditional model of, hey, we're going to take you and we're going to put you right in treatment, and then 30 days later you're going to come out and you're going to relapse, and something really bad's going to happen, like maybe you overdose and die, like that doesn't work for everybody. The traditional drug court, which works for a lot of other people, it hasn't worked for you, so we're going to put you in this model. So the police officer is able to do something different and see value in the fact that they're getting somebody help. And the police officer is also going to get feedback because they're going to have some involvement, because we're, as a group, going to talk and do case management and hear about how that person's doing and recognize the value. So LEAD does that. LEAD gives that officer that tool to be able to, instead of make that traditional arrest where they're just going to see that person cycle back through the system over and over again, not get any help, get more frustrated. The community is going to be more frustrated because there is no change in the community. There's ultimately no actual changes in what's going on. We haven't increased public safety. We're going to increase public safety, and we're going to make that person's life better, and we're also going to make the police officer's job easier. And we're going to get a resource out on the street in that case manager doing a job that the police have been asked to do, unfairly so, been asked to do. We're going to have a case manager that's out there doing that, and the police officers are going to see the case managers actually out there doing that. So LEAD does that for them. One of the other things LEAD can do is, instead of waiting till somebody commits a crime, folks that are already involved in our system and that police already know, they can make what we call a social contact referral. So if an officer already knows me, they've already arrested me 15 times, they already know all the issues, they can come to me and say, hey, we have this program. It's called LEAD. If you'd like some help, I can get you some help. And you'll hear me say help over and over again, because we don't tell people like, hey, do you want treatment? Because first of all, a lot of people run away when they hear treatment. Second of all, I don't know about anybody else, but I have yet to find anywhere in the country where somebody can say, I'll get you treatment, get in my car, I'm going to drive you right to a bed. Because treatment's just not readily available. So we can't lie to the people that we're dealing with, and we can't lie to our police officers and act like we're going to get somebody a bed and they're going to get all better. So we're going to say to that person, do you want help? And you can get them right in with a case manager. The only difference with the social contact referral is obviously they're going to do an assessment, but there's obviously no charge that ultimately gets dropped. Now with lead, you hear me say that all up front? That's all up front, but we still need the partnership of our prosecutors. We need the partnership of probation. We need the partnership of the public defender's office. And Albany's first client, who had 44 previous arrests, 22 previous convictions, if we didn't have the prosecutor's office on board, he would have went to jail in a county west of Albany after he had been enrolled and doing really, really well for a charge that was still outstanding in that county. And I wouldn't have been able to say that he has not committed a crime since April 3rd of 2016, and that unfortunately he had one relapse, and when he relapsed, the first person he called was his case manager. And he's doing amazingly well. But that wouldn't have been true if we didn't have the district attorney's office to be able to talk to the district attorney's office in that county and say, hey, this is the progress this guy has made. And if you put him in your jail, he's going to lose his methadone program, he's going to lose his housing, and he's going to lose his Medicaid. And that's not smart. So I'm going to turn things over to the district attorney, and we will go from there.
Good morning, everybody. That took a lot out of you. 8 o'clock. Be up here early, too. I'm complaining, too. I got my inner voice, and the monologue is going. But we will get through this. Hi, Carolyn. How are you? One of my favorite DAs in the state of New York, Carolyn Wojtacek from Niagara County. Karen, say hello. She doesn't want me to single her out, but you know, I have beef with Carolyn a little bit. So a few years ago, we were at our summer conference, and you know, I think she was relatively new. We came over, introduced myself, my executive director, who brought her companion dog, because you know we have to have companion dogs everywhere now. Decided to go to the bathroom right behind me. And Carolyn and I talking, and this violent thing just surfaced in our face, and Carolyn actually thought it was me. So I still harbor a little of that. I mean, it's not the kind of thing you want your yes, it was the dog. It was the dog. So I want to piggyback off of some things that Brendan said. But I wanted to give you the 100-yard view of what we're talking about here today, and then try to put some things that we're doing in context. What I'm really proud of in terms of Albany County and in our commitment to diversion is that we seem to have excellent diversion in every facet of the system, from the facet of the arrest to the prosecution, to probation, which actually exists on both sides of the prosecution, as well as our correctional facility here in Albany County. And I don't want you to walk away with this perception that, boy, all of these leaders got together, decided to, you know, brainstorm and develop this continuum of diversion. It didn't happen that way. As a matter of fact, it happened with a lot of tension, I think, over time. I think it happened. I'm forgetting to also mention the courts, trying to convince them to do something different was not the most pleasant experience. But I think over time, and I would say roughly about 20 years, we've arrived at a place where, you know, if people are going to get second chances, and a second or third or fourth bite at the apple, your chances of getting it in Albany County here are better than in most counties. And therefore, I wanted to first and foremost introduce the subject that we're talking about in terms of the much bigger picture, but I wanted to just drill down a bit and talk about specifically prosecution. You know, I happened to come out of that class of prosecutors in the early 2000s that became like a community prosecutor. I don't know if you remember, but under the Clinton administration, there were grants for community prosecution that were really built off the models of community policing. The whole idea was to take a prosecutor, put that prosecutor, embed that prosecutor in the community, work with community members to identify sort of the low-hanging fruit, become problem solvers, and then develop strategies to address those issues that were proven to be resistant to traditional criminal justice practice. but also to try to build relationships with community. And that's how I got my start. And I don't think that you can talk about community prosecution or diversion without necessarily addressing the issue of restorative justice. Restorative justice back in the 2000s was just this thing that people in our practice feared so much because it was, first of all, it's from Australia. And I don't know, from New Zealand and Australia, other than a wombat, deadly spiders, poisonous frogs, every time you watch anything that has to do with Australia, it's never good. But, you know, people feared it. Judges specifically didn't want anything to do with it. Prosecutors shunned it. And our partners in law enforcement were never going to agree to it. Except that when you work in a local court, for example, like in the Albany City Court, and you're just so inundated by volume, you have to really figure out how you're going to be able to deliver your criminal justice services to victims of crime, as well as keep a calendar moving and, you know, not having to spend a tremendous amount of time on every case. And if you've ever been to a city court in any city, you begin to realize one thing rather quickly. 30% of the cases that are there should have never gotten there. 30% of the cases, something happened, you're just not sure, you got to do a little more work. And then there's less than 30% that, boy, there are people that are hurting each other and you really got to focus all of your time and energy on doing those cases. I thought restorative justice was a perfect model to apply, at least for the first third. We're safe with the first third. The first third is the people having arguments. They just, you broke my fence, you know, you scratched my car, you're parking in the wrong spot, blah, blah, blah. Those cases are in city court. So we reached out to the community and we partnered with the Albany County Probation Department, reached out to the community and brought a group of people together. People from our churches, activists that were in the community. And we brought them together and we created what's called the Community Accountability Board. And they were going to apply the restorative justice principles for those cases that we diverted out of Albany City Court. So it was a brand new day in Albany, much to the dismay of some of the judges that we had at Albany City Court at the time that were just unwilling to try anything. And the way that you can overcome some of those objections is by really looking at your criminal procedure law and just looking at the criminal procedure law and saying, okay, this is what it says we can do here, but what is it not saying, right? And oftentimes when you're talking about diversion, it's the spaces in between what the law says and what it's not saying that we have the opportunity to be very creative. After all, if you're a prosecutor, you have discretion. Well, how are you exercising that discretion? You can exercise discretion not to bring charges. You can exercise discretion to offer defense attorney, just about anything as long as it's lawful, right? With restorative justice, we had to train people, community members, brought them together. We took that entire swath, that 1/3, and we diverted them to restorative justice. Now, back in those days, you could be a little cynical. Say, man, I just want to get them out of my court because I want to do the work. I want that 1/3 that really we have people that are hurting each other. Except when you start to attend these restorative justice, panels with the Community Accountability Board, you begin to realize that there's something real that's happening here, right? The defendant who's in court is not speaking to anybody. They have someone speaking for them. They have a prosecutor that is speaking about them. Then they have a judge that's speaking at them. First time I've ever heard of a defendant actually communicating with Mother Conway from church was sitting in that room and watching that connection. And I knew right then and there after the very first session that there was something powerful here. And if we have a chance to turn this thing around, it's going to be by leveraging the leadership of community to address the issues that are happening in community and steering a lot of these young people in the right course. Oftentimes I think we also have this vision as to who it is that's going to benefit from restorative justice practices. It's not always young people. I say young people now because I can. I'm going to be 50, which means if you ain't 50 or older, y'all young people, all right? But that was the first experiment with something different in the criminal justice system and in diversion in Albany County. Well, the reason we're here to talk about GIVE, and the reason why we're here is also to address how you can take a basic principle like restorative justice practices and expand it to address more serious crimes. And believe you me, there's no one out there volunteering to put a person who has just been involved in some kind of robbery, a person who's just been involved in some kind of burglary, a person who's in possession of a weapon. There's no one rushing to take those cases out of the traditional stream of prosecution and putting them into anything that calls for diversion. But we also felt that based upon the volume of cases and the facts that we see every single day, there are those cases that fit. Now, some of you here are aware, I mean, I'm sure most of you are, that the state of New York several years ago passed this law. It was called Raise the Age. And the principals of Raise the Age were very, they wanted to take young people out of the adult system and provide services, help them steer clear of getting that conviction that could hamper their abilities to move forward in the future. So those were really the things that were designed with Raise the Age. And we did the 16-year-olds, and this year we now have 17-year-olds in family court. And there was a lot of debate about, well, should it just be 16 and 17-year-olds? There's a lot of information out there about brain development. We listened to a lot of that. And so we figured in the office that, well, if the state's going to do Raise the Age, can we do something to cover the other kids from 18 to 24? And we decided to do that, right? So we created what's called the Clean Slate program within the office that addresses three things, diversion, reentry, and expungement. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say this. If you're considering doing anything along the lines of diversion, the strength of your programs is going to really be based upon the strength of the service providers that you work with and you bring to the table. If you're a community that has a number of service providers, you've got to be able to leverage those people to be able to do the work and help the people that are before you. But we figured that we would focus on diversion in three ways. What are we doing with the young people that are coming in the system? Are we doing enough to make sure that we're diverting them out so that they're not too deep into the system before it's too late? The other thing we wanted to do is, what about the people that are coming out? What are we doing for them? Are we putting ourselves, or are we making ourselves available to help those individuals with things that we can? And then there's those people that have been out for a long time, that just can't get beyond the deli section at Price Chopper because of their felony convictions. We have to have a very serious conversation moving forward about expungement and sealing. We have to have a very serious conversation. We can talk about the future, but there's so many people who are now parents, who have children in school, who also want to play soccer, who also have a desire for iPhones, and these parents need to be able to provide those things. I'm not saying an iPhone, but parents need to provide those experiences for kids, and they can't get to the next level in their professional development because of that ridiculous thing that they did when they were 17 years old or 18 years old or 22 years old. We got to be able to deal with that. That's what Clean Slate attempts to do. What did we do for diversion? Here's what we did. We took the restorative justice concept, which was a community accountability board, and said, if you think about it, why don't we create a community grand jury system where we invite members of the community and empanel them and apply the same rules that we apply in grand jury, except the purpose here is not to indict, issue a no bill, or to do a report. What we would give them an option to do is, hey, send this person to a felony cab, pretrial probation, or why don't you recommend to the DA's office what we should do in terms of a sentence, youthful offender status, or anything like that as we move the case through the traditional process. So here is the example. If you are 18, 19, 20 years old, up to 24 in Albany County, and you have a nonviolent offense that you are charged with, our prosecutors are trained where they look at the file and say, okay, this guy's involvement was minimal, although he was in the car. This should not be a case that we prosecute. Why don't we send this case to the diversion board? That prosecutor, like the grand jury, goes into the diversion board meeting, which takes place on the last Wednesday of every month in Albany County, and stands there in front of community members, their volunteers, their former teachers that are retired, police officers, firemen, community members, church people. Everybody's on this board. And that prosecutor presents that case just like they would be presenting that case in the grand jury. That board is allowed to call witnesses if they want. If they want to hear from the police officer directly, that board can ask for that. And at the end of the defense attorney, unlike the grand jury, defense attorney is also allowed to come into the room and to make a pitch for that person who's accused to go before the board. If the board decides to take on that person, the board will make a referral to what's called our felony cab. These are restorative justice trained people who will sit with that young person, have that conversation, lay out a plan that involves education, employment, treatment if necessary, all of those issues. The DA's office will hold off on that prosecution for a period of 2 years. We will say, okay, we're not going to do anything. I know I'm being filmed, but it's really called the get your blank together period. You got 2 years to get your blank together and come back and let us know what's going on, and we want to be able to dismiss this case. And therefore, you have never dipped your toe into the system. You can tell people that you've never been arrested, you've never been prosecuted. This is what we are doing, and it's been successful for us. It's not always successful, but it has been successful for us. Let me tell you what we've learned about our population of youth between the ages of 16 and 24 in Albany County. And if it's happening in Albany County, it's happening in your county. This is the population of people that are getting the least amount of services and help in our community. The least. Let me be clear. If you're a 10-year-old kid, everybody loves you because you're cute. If you're a 12-year-old kid, everybody loves you because you're cute. If you're a 15-year-old kid, nobody loves you because you ain't cute no more. Your pants are sagging, someone's judging you on how you appear. What we have found is so many of our young people that are appearing before us are surfing couches of friends because they are homeless. There's no place that's just sitting there saying, okay, we're going to help 16-year-olds find homes in our city. We're dealing with unbearable poverty. And so we think of our Community Accountability Board and our Felony Youth Diversion Board as this amazing thing that's helping people and preventing them from getting these felony convictions, except for the fact that the young people who are coming before us, this is like the fourth thing on their list that's really making life hard for them. And so as we're trying to get them to engage, they're just looking and saying, I need something to eat today, and I need a place to sleep. And so as you build on your diversion programs, you have to build it considering that you have to meet people where they're at. And if you want to set expectations for them, because there is raising the age, but we want to raise expectations, you've got to be able to partner with the right organizations to make sure that, that those expectations are met so that these young people can begin working on themselves. I will let Renee talk a little bit more about the mechanics of the board, and I just wanted to touch on the last thing that I started talking about earlier that I've covered, and I think I've done so with detail. Raised the age a few years ago, allowed for provision, created a provision, I believe it's 160.59, which allows for sealing of criminal convictions. Right? Let's talk about that for a minute. That was passed. If you want to talk to me about criminal justice reform, I think in the last 20 years, that hidden little piece of legislation is the most important thing to vulnerable communities today in America, not just in New York, in America. That provision, right? To allow for people to come out from under the burden of a previous conviction is relief beyond comprehension for those of us who are sitting here. I cannot imagine what it's like to go try to get a job at Target, at Walmart, at any place and be told no because of some dumb thing I did when I was 17 years old and I was going out with her. I'm not blaming her. I didn't go out with her. That's an example, But if you're talking about the 1/3 of what I would call dumb blank issues that we have at Albany City Court, that I said that were 1/3 of the cases that we can just move right off the table and get rid of, there are people living with the consequences of that irrelevant third that I've just said is irrelevant. And so until we figure out and we expand the opportunities for people to actually expunge their records, to get those records sealed, we're not really moving the ball. So we have a program that's called the Redemption Program. And we have partnered with the Albany County Bar Association, a great group of people. They're training, we're doing CLEs with the Albany County Bar Association, so they're training defense attorneys because these motions have to be brought by the defense attorneys. We've appointed prosecutors within the office that are specifically designated as expungement and sealing prosecutors. And we are, with a month away from launching a full-blown campaign educating people in community about these opportunities. Our goal is to make sure that if you're walking into a barbershop, if you're walking into a business in community, right, you need to see a poster, you need to be made aware of what benefit you can receive from 160.59. I just want to make a comment about that, though. 160.59 applies to a small sliver of people. It needs to be expanded. So you have to be out of corrections for 10 years. You could have only one felony and one misdemeanor, or possibly 2 misdemeanors. I don't know anybody that falls within that category. I know people that fall within the category of 1 felony and maybe 3 or 4 misdemeanors, right? And they're all nonviolent. Again, the one disposable third in city court practice. What we've been doing that's rather unique in the state of New York is we've been using the 440 motion, right, which allows a defendant to petition the court to reopen a file. And we're having conversations with defense attorneys and saying, okay, look, if this is a nonviolent, offense that took place that's prohibiting them from taking advantage of the full sealing, why don't we revisit the old cases, take a look at them and see if we can reopen them, dispose of them, so now a person who didn't qualify because they may have 3 misdemeanors and 1 felony, or 2 nonviolent felonies and 1 misdemeanor, we want to be able to expunge some of those records so that we can get them to qualify for appropriate sealing. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have a lot of time left. This, to me, is the most important frontier that we could be engaging in, because I see communities, and Albany does the same, like Troy. They have these job fairs, and these job fairs are designed for people who are coming out of corrections. If you're not talking about sealing, what are we talking about job fairs? I think they're still important, but we need to make sure that the jobs that talented and skilled people who have redeemed themselves, right, we need to make sure that those jobs enable them to earn a living and to provide for their families. And now, to give you a little bit more detail as the actual mechanics of the board, I'm going to introduce to you the person who runs that board, Renee Merges.
Hi, everybody. So just going forward, so I just want to give you the update on this board that was created. I think we've been going almost 3 years now. Just a tiny bit about me, because I feel like I kind of represent what the criminal justice system has come. In 1984, when I was in my first justice court, I'm a career prosecutor. I've been out teaching 10 years, and now I'm back handling the diversion programs in the office, which I think is probably very novel. But in any event, in 1984, in my first justice court, somebody came to me and said that there was somebody with a low-level crime in it, and they wanted me to consider sending them to treatment instead of jail. And as a young prosecutor, probably one of my first days in that court, I said out loud, I don't think they pay me to do that, because they didn't. And so to work that, to kind of wrap that around and to get permission, I mean, it was just something. This is a whole new world we're in today, and I think a place that we need to be. So just the Felony Youth Diversion Board, and then I want to turn it over to Kerry to talk about all the great corrections alternatives, and then there'll be some minutes to talk. So right now we have admitted 32, over the last 3 years, 32 felony candidates to felony youth diversion. We have 16 pending. Approximately 8 have graduated, having fulfilled this reparative agreement with the Felony Community Accountability Board, and unfortunately 8 of them we had to kick out because they did not do that and they went the traditional prosecution route. So at this point we feel very positive about it, and we're continuing, as David said, to screen every case that comes into the office where there's a felony arrest by someone between 18 and 24. Many of them, unfortunately, will never qualify for felony youth diversion because they're violent crimes. People have histories, but we are doing our best to do it. Just a little bit of hope I wanted to impart to you, because we're very encouraged by the work that actually the community is doing on the Community Accountability Board, on the Felony Youth Diversion Board, and the Community Accountability Boards as well. And now I'll turn it over to Kerry. Thank you.
So good morning. So following David, I already ran out of time about 5 minutes ago, so I'll be real brief so we have time for some questions here. So to change the philosophy from where we came on when I was a young officer 25 plus years ago, we've come full circle. We are the social workers now. We are the people that are getting people into treatment. And then, as far as our correctional facility, our sheriff has been very aggressive on providing services because we have a captive audience there, all right? So while they're there, typically before, we just lock them up, let them sit there, and then we let them out. And we do the same thing over and over and over again. Didn't work. So to change our philosophy from the street cops as well as the people that are in the correctional services wasn't easy. I mean, that's something that was ingrained in that culture, and we had to change it. But I'm proud to say, with partnering with everybody here, that culture has changed. We've got people that were resistant to the change now bringing ideas to us and wanting to make it better in the correctional service. So I'll just hit real briefly, I'll hit some of the programs that we started. We have our Sheriff's Heroin Addiction Recovery Program, which is a dedicated pod where we brought all those folks that were struggling with heroin or other substances together to live in a community setting. We brought outside partners. Addictions Care Center of Albany has been a huge partner for us. They provide addictive services, the counseling services, group services. They also have individual counsel, sessions with these individuals. But what's more important is they're all living together and they lean on each other. They all had similar experiences, so they help to heal each other. They get that intensive treatment while they're in there, so when they leave, hopefully they have that good foundation so they can continue on. One of the other things is we do prepare a exit strategy with them. So prior to their release, we have CASACs that are working right in the facility. They review everything with them to find out what's best for them, what best suits them. There's different programs out there, and everybody doesn't belong at the Addictions Care Center. Somebody may be better at Hope House or Hospitality House or something like that. So they get that, and typically what we do would give them a bus pass, and on their way they would go. We don't do that anymore. Now we take them, actually physically drive them to their treatment center, make their appointments, and get them set up so they can continue on with their treatment. We had an event up in Clifton Park or Half Moon area where we spoke at a church group. And it wasn't a plant, but there was a guy that stood up in that. He was our first graduate from our SHARP program. He said, I just want to thank everybody for what you're doing. I've been on the installment plan for 40 years, in and out of the correctional setting. Nobody gave me help while I was in there. I just sat there and did time. So he was a 40-year criminal that has now got a job with the state. He's got a job with the state agency. He pays bills. He's got his own car. He's got a girlfriend now. And he's living a productive life. But he's like, nobody ever gave me this help. And he was just so grateful to have it. And it made us feel good about what we were doing. Not only did he do that, his daughter, who was also part of that, that whole cycle where she was committing crimes, she had a warrant for her. He's like, typically what we would do, we would hide her and to try to avoid arrest. But he actually drove her to the police department, turned her in, and got her the help that she needed. So I mean, it just continues on. It's a big cycle. Another one of the programs I'll touch on real quickly is Soldier On. Soldier On deals with veterans. We have that group of organization comes in and does counseling, teaches soldiers and veterans that are returning, that are self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, how to regain normalcy in their life, how to pay bills, how to be a productive member of society. I'll hit the recidivism rates on all these afterwards because I want to hit it real quick so we have time for questions. Our MAT program that we started, the medically assisted treatment program, crazy successful. While they're in there, they're still continued on the medication that they were on. They get an opportunity to start medications so they can deal with their drug addictions. And that program has been, you'll see by the recidivism rates, extremely successful. New Beginnings. So a New Beginnings program, the sheriff started a New Beginnings program back in January. Typically what would happen is an inmate would come in, get booked in, go to the tier, and they would sit there. They'd get a card that says, okay, this is what we have to offer you. And then it would be like, we'd wait for them to respond to us and ask for help. 90% of the time, nobody asked for help. They just sat there and did their time. Now we have caseworkers that actually meet with every individual that comes in there and says, okay, listen, you've been here 3 or 4 times in the last 6 months. What is the problem? Is it because you don't have ID, you don't have a job, you don't have transportation, maybe you don't have housing, maybe you have a drug addiction or another substance use disorder, mental health. And then we get them the services they need while they're in there so they can continue that when they leave. We make those partnerships and those bonds so that then when they leave, they can continue on the road to being a productive member of society. Just changing people's behavior, just showing that you care means a lot. And we never did that before. It was just lock them away, throw away the key type of philosophy. Recidivism rates, that revolving door that people come in and out of the correctional setting. Typically, the general recidivism rate is around 45%. Those with addictions is much higher, usually in the 70 percentile. Our SHARP program, since we started it in 2015, actually October 2015, is at 17%. 17% of the people that are involved in that population actually come back to jail. So that population is somewhere around 70%, and now it's 17% after they have the intensive treatment. They continue it on the outside. They don't come back to jail. Soldier On is at 9%. Our medically assisted treatment program, 3%. That's only been going since January, but 3%, of the people that typically would just get released, they may relapse, overdose because because of the circumstances of their addiction. So with that declining population, we have a jail that houses 1,043, and at the height of the crack epidemic, we were in the 900s typically. We're at a little over 400 now. And that's with 100-plus borders. So we actually have 300 and some county inmates. With that being said, we decertified and are decommissioning a building, which is 100 units, that we have plans to make housing for homeless individuals. So if somebody leaves our correctional facility and they don't have a place to go, rather than going to the mission and committing crimes, now they're going to be able to continue the services they had on the one side of the jail, come on to the other side, and then we're also going to be able to house other homeless individuals from the streets that are causing all those low-level crimes that Brendan and David talked about. That if we got them help, we wouldn't have to deal with that. So I'll end on that note just so we can continue on. But thank you.
So we can just open things up to any questions? Sure. and with LEAD, we build in a community component. So number one, there's community education, but the community actually has a seat at the table. So depending on where we are, we have civil rights groups that are involved and actually are on our policy group, so they're part of the decision maker. And then we actually built a community leadership team that's made up of neighborhood folks, of folks with lived experience that give us guidance and direction on what we're doing. And they actually took it upon themselves with some of our officers to go out into the neighborhood association meetings, go around town and present on LEAD. So the community knew what we were doing and understood it. There were still some folks that were like, well, we want people to arrest folks. And there's, we didn't change everybody's mind, but they were able to kind of make the case of like, well, here's why we're doing this. We're trying to actually continue to drive the crime rates down. One of the things we were able to show is that crime rates continued to go down, arrests went down, and contacts went down. So it wasn't like we were like, arrests were going down, but the crime rate was going up. The two of those were going down. We were still having spikes sometimes, especially with violent crime, but property crimes and things were going down. And then we did open things up on diversions where victims were involved, and we made it our standard policy that if a victim said, no, I want an arrest, we made that arrest. We didn't overrule a victim. But community engagement, it has to happen. You can't do this without having community engagement. Right. And the other piece that was that did help with community that was opposed and said they wanted an arrest, when I was able to say, hey, the police officers who are normally tied up for 2.5 hours doing an arrest are done with this process in 30 minutes. They were like, oh, you mean an officer is going to be in my neighborhood now, not tied up all that time? And I was like, yeah, they're going to be done. They were like, I'll take that over having them make an arrest for, somebody panhandling. But yeah, it's the community engagement. We were lucky because we'd already started to build that infrastructure. So I had both a community policing advisory group of people from every single ward in the city that we educated on, and then the civil rights group that was involved with us on LEAD itself built that community leadership team, and they did a ton of organizing around the city. So that they took that off of our plate, and all we had to do was fill people in to do that. And like David and myself and Craig Apple, the sheriff, we did some of that with them at different times, depending where we were. We had a couple of specific public forums. We would have quarterly public forums anyways for community policing. So we made a couple of those specifically focused around LEAD. So we explained exactly what it was. So that way when people knew, like, hey, you're still going to see this individual out, but recognize that these are going to be some of the services they get. And if you're still seeing problems, we want to know because we can still address those. Like the case manager, harm reduction is a weird thing. It's like, we're recognizing that your behavior, you're not necessarily ready, willing, or able to make big changes, but that doesn't mean we're just going to let you run wild. That doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want. We're like, well, we recognize they can make their own plan. It's like, no, you can't just continue to run the streets wild. Our case managers are going to work with you to be like, hey, that behavior is not acceptable. You've got to be able to make some changes to not have that behavior. But it's not. There were plenty of public meetings that people were like, how dare you say you're not going to arrest somebody? And I'd be like, and I had a lot of community members then that would stand up and be like, well, that's because that's what we don't want him arresting these folks. But when you really got down to the meat and bones, especially when you can point to the research and say, well, there's a 58% reduction in recidivism for folks that go through LEAD as opposed to folks that we arrest. So, don't we want that? And people would be like, well, yeah, I guess if the research is there. I saw another hand up there. Jeff? And no? You're good? Sure? Okay.
As you're moving people into these community partners, the different, most of them I was seeing nonprofit organizations, was there a need for funding or extra capacity with them, and how did you address that challenge? Because you're really kind of moving the cost, shall we say. I mean, I hate to put it that way because we're dealing with people, but you're moving the cost from government out of government into nonprofits. How did that work?
So for LEAD, you need dedicated case managers. That's all they're doing is working with the participants from LEAD. And it's a ratio of about 25 participants to one case manager. We were lucky. We're in a Medicaid expansion state, so you can actually use Medicaid dollars to do this. Our first case manager was paid for by Albany Medical Center because they needed to. There's studies out there that show that the super utilizers of the criminal justice system are also the super utilizers of the emergency room. And we actually played that out with our first few clients. They were, in fact, going to the emergency room for a lot of serious medical issues. So our first case manager, which, by the way, like our case managers throughout the country get paid like what I got paid when I was a rookie cop. It's pathetic. So they don't get paid a lot of money. It's not a costly adventure, at least venture, as far as I'll let folks here fill in on the other programs. But basically, for the city of Albany, the size of the city of Albany, you can run a lead program for about $500,000 a year.
With respect to the clean slate programs, those programs, you don't have to invest any capital because it relies on volunteers. And if you're, for example, in Albany, there are so many retired, amazing professionals that want to get involved and just didn't know how. And so we've provided them the means. And then with respect to the agencies that we've partnered with, like the Glenmont Job Corps, these are agencies that are open right now that have to provide those services. And so to the best that we can, we direct, the young people towards those pre-existing services.